The blizzard struck without warning, turning the interstate into a corridor of white chaos. Wind screamed across the asphalt, tearing at everything in its path. In a small house at the edge of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, an elderly woman named Eleanor Hayes sat beside her crackling fireplace, unaware that her quiet evening was about to be shattered by the roar of 20 motorcycle engines fighting for survival against nature's fury. Eleanor was 73 years old, a retired schoolteacher who had spent the last 8 years alone after her husband Thomas, a decorated Vietnam veteran, passed away from complications related to Agent Orange exposure. Her modest two-story home, once filled with the laughter of dinner parties and the warmth of family gatherings, had become a sanctuary of silence. The rooms echoed with memories rather than voices, and the garden Thomas once tended had grown wild and untamed. Before we continue with Eleanor's story, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and if this story touches your heart, please hit that like button. It helps us share more stories like this with people who need to hear them. The house stood on Riverside Road, a narrow street that wound along the Susquehanna River, connecting Millbrook to the highway 15 miles north. In summer, the road was picturesque, lined with oak trees and wildflowers. But in winter, it became treacherous, a forgotten pathway that the county plow trucks rarely prioritized. Tonight, as the storm descended with biblical fury, Riverside Road had become a death trap. Eleanor had lived through 60 Pennsylvania winters. She knew the signs of a bad storm, the particular quality of silence before the first flakes fell, the way the chickadees disappeared from her bird feeder, the ache in her arthritic knees that predicted pressure changes better than any weather forecast. She had prepared as she always did, bringing in extra firewood, filling pots with water in case the pipes froze, and checking that her oil lamps had fuel. Her preparations were ritual, performed with the efficiency of someone who had long ago accepted that self-reliance was not optional but essential. The wind had started around 5 in the evening, gentle at first, then building steadily until it howled like something alive and angry. By 7 o'clock, snow was falling so thickly that Eleanor could no longer see the outline of her barn 30 yards from her kitchen window. The electricity had flickered twice, a warning she heeded by lighting 2 kerosene lamps and placing them strategically in the living room and kitchen. The television, her usual companion during dinner, sat dark and silent. She ate her modest meal of soup and bread by lamplight, the shadows dancing on walls covered with photographs of a life that felt increasingly distant. Thomas smiled at her from a dozen frames. Thomas, in his army uniform, fresh-faced and impossibly young. Thomas, on their wedding day, his hand gentle on her waist. Thomas is holding their son Michael as a newborn, pride and terror mingling in his expression. Michael had moved to Seattle 12 years ago, building a technology life that Eleanor didn't quite understand. He called every Sunday, dutiful and kind, but the distance between them was measured in more than miles. He had his own family now, 2 boys she saw mainly through photographs sent via text message, a technology she had learned reluctantly. Eleanor washed her dishes slowly, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Time had become elastic in her solitude, stretching and contracting without external anchors. An hour could feel like 10 minutes, or 10 minutes like an eternity. She had learned to fill her days with small rituals. Morning tea at 7, tending to her indoor plants at 9, reading until lunch, afternoon correspondence with her few remaining friends, dinner at 6, then reading again until sleep came. The routine was armor against the emptiness that threatened to consume her when she stopped moving. She had just settled into Thomas's old recliner, a mystery novel open in her lap, when she heard it. At first, she thought it was the wind playing tricks, creating sounds that resembled human machinery. But the sound grew louder, more distinct. Engines. Multiple engines. The deep, guttural rumble of motorcycles cuts through the storm's roar. Eleanor's heart quickened. Motorcycles. Here. On Riverside Road, in the middle of a blizzard. It made no sense. The road led nowhere except to the highway, and no one in their right mind would be riding in these conditions. She set her book aside and moved to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain she had drawn against the cold. At first, she saw nothing but white chaos. Then, like ghosts materializing from the storm, headlights appeared. One, then two, then five, then more. They came slowly, weaving slightly, the beams cutting weak tunnels through the driving snow. The sound grew louder until it seemed to fill her entire house, vibrating through the floorboards and rattling the china in her cabinet. They stopped at the end of her driveway. 20 motorcycles, their riders hunched against the wind, their machines trembling with mechanical exhaustion. Even from her window, Eleanor could see they were in trouble. The way they moved, stiff and jerky, told her they were past the point of cold and into the dangerous territory of hypothermia. Their leather jackets, designed for wind resistance at highway speeds, offered little protection against the kind of cold that had descended tonight. Eleanor's hands trembled as she gripped the curtain. Her mind raced with possibilities, each more frightening than the last. She lived alone, miles from her nearest neighbor. Her phone was a landline, and even if she called the sheriff, no one would reach her for hours in these conditions. She was vulnerable in every way that mattered: old, alone, and female. These men, whoever they were, could do anything. The knock came. 3 heavy thuds against her front door, urgent but not aggressive. Then nothing. She waited, barely breathing. Another knock, louder this time, followed by a voice that barely carried over the wind. "Please, we need help." The voice was male, rough but not threatening. There was desperation in it, the kind of desperation that came from facing death and finding it closer than expected. Eleanor stood frozen in her living room, every instinct screaming contradictory commands. Lock the door. Call for help. Hide. But another voice spoke too, quieter but insistent. It was Thomas's voice, carried in memory but feeling as real as if he stood beside her. "People surprise you, Ellie," he had told her once, years ago, when she had locked the car doors after seeing a homeless man approaching in a parking lot. That man might have just wanted to ask directions. Fear makes us cruel when we should be careful. There's a difference. Thomas had been a soldier, trained to assess threats, and yet he had been the most open-hearted man she had ever known. He had believed in giving people a chance, in looking past appearances to find the human beneath. He had taught her that lesson over and over during their 43 years together, and she had watched him live it daily. Eleanor took a breath that felt like it might be her last as a woman who made safe choices. Then she walked to the door. Her hand hovered over the deadbolt for a moment, doubt clawing at her resolve. But she thought of Thomas, thought of all the times he had helped stranded travelers, thought of the man he had been and the woman she had tried to be, and she turned the lock. The door opened, and the storm rushed in, bringing with it a wall of cold that took her breath away. Standing on her porch was a man who looked carved from winter itself. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his beard encrusted with ice, his face red and chapped from wind exposure. His leather jacket was soaked through, useless against the cold. Behind him, she could see the others, 20 shapes huddled in the driveway, their motorcycles forming a semicircle of chrome and steel. The man removed his glove with difficulty, his fingers stiff and clumsy, and pulled off his helmet. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw no threat, only exhaustion and desperate hope. "Ma'am," he said, his voice hoarse, "my name is Jack Reeves. We're part of the Iron Brotherhood. We got caught in the storm 20 miles back. 3 of our guys are hypothermic. We've been riding for an hour trying to find shelter. Your light was the first one we've seen. We don't mean any harm. We just need to get warm." Eleanor looked past him at the others. Even in the dim light from her porch, she could see how badly they were struggling. 2 men were supporting a third between them, his head lolling forward. Another sat on his bike, swaying slightly, clearly disoriented. These were not men looking for trouble. These were men fighting to survive. "Come in," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "All of you." Quickly, Jack Reeves's expression transformed. For a moment, his hardness cracked, and she saw raw gratitude flash across his face. He turned and made a gesture to the others. They responded immediately, moving toward her door with the sluggish urgency of people whose bodies were shutting down. They filed in one by one, bringing the smell of leather and gasoline and wet wool. They were large men, made larger by their jackets and boots, and her small entryway became impossibly crowded. Snow and water pooled on her hardwood floors. Their breath came in ragged gasps, visible clouds in the warm air of her home. "Kitchen," Eleanor said, pointing. "There's a wood stove in there. Living room, too. Spread out. Take off your wet clothes. I'll get blankets." They obeyed without question, moving with the careful slowness of men whose extremities were numb. Eleanor hurried upstairs, her mind racing. She had blankets, quilts that Thomas's mother had made, wool blankets from their camping days, throws from every room in the house. She gathered them all, her arms barely able to hold the stack, and carried them down. The house had transformed. 20 large men filled her small spaces, making her home feel both crowded and alive in a way it hadn't been in years. They had shed their jackets, revealing tattoos and scars, worn flannel shirts, and calloused hands. They looked like what they were, working men, men who lived rough lives and carried them in their bodies. Eleanor distributed blankets, moving from man to man with the efficiency of a teacher managing a classroom. Some thanked her quietly. Others just nodded, too cold or too overwhelmed to speak. She found the 3 hypothermic riders and put them closest to the wood stove, wrapping them in multiple layers, checking their pulses the way Thomas had taught her years ago. "I'll make coffee," she announced to no one in particular. "And soup. I have vegetable soup. It's not much, but it's hot." "Ma'am," Jack Reeves said, "you've already done more than we had any right to ask." "Nonsense," Eleanor replied, her teacher's voice emerging instinctively. "You'll catch your death without proper food. Now sit down and get warm." She worked in her kitchen with 20 strangers filling her home, and somehow it felt right. Her hands remembered rhythms they hadn't practiced in years, the efficiency of cooking for a crowd, the organization of feeding many with little. She had been a teacher for 35 years, and before that, she had grown up in a large family where cooking was communal and constant. The skills came back like muscle memory. The soup heated on the stove, and she supplemented it with everything she had. Bread she had baked 2 days earlier, cheese from her refrigerator, apples from her fruit bowl, crackers from her pantry. It wasn't enough to truly feed 20 men, but it would warm them, and warmth was what they needed most. As she worked, she listened to them talk. Their voices were low, respectful of her space, but gradually growing stronger as circulation returned to their extremities. They spoke in the shorthand of men who knew each other well, finishing each other's sentences, referencing shared experiences. She caught fragments: a wedding they had all attended in Pittsburgh, a brother who had recently become a father, a fundraiser they were planning for a children's hospital. "We ride every year," one of them said, "for kids with cancer. Raised $50,000 last year." Eleanor paused in her stirring. These were not the men she had feared when she first saw them. These were men with families, with causes, with lives that extended beyond the leather and chrome that defined them in the public imagination. She ladled soup into every bowl and mug she owned, supplementing with coffee cups when she ran out. The men accepted them with hands that still shook, cradling the warmth like something precious. They ate slowly at first, then with growing appetite as their bodies woke up and demanded fuel. Jack Reeves appeared in her kitchen doorway. He had shed his leather jacket and wore a simple black t-shirt that revealed arms covered in intricate tattoos. One caught her eye, a military insignia she recognized. The 101st Airborne Division. Thomas's division. "You served," she said, pointing to the tattoo. Jack looked down at his arm, then back at her. 2 tours in Iraq. You recognize it. My husband was 101st Vietnam. Understanding passed between them, the kind of understanding that needed no words. Jack nodded slowly, and his expression softened further. Then he'd understand what we are, Jack said quietly. We're mostly vets. Brothers who came back and didn't quite fit anymore. The road gave us purpose. The club gave us family. Eleanor felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the last vestiges of fear. She understood now. These men were not so different from Thomas, from the men he had served with. Men who had seen things that changed them and found they needed each other to carry the weight. The storm raged outside, but inside Eleanor's small house, something unexpected was happening. Walls were coming down. The walls that separated stranger from host, fear from trust, isolation from connection. The men began to relax, their voices growing warmer, occasionally punctuated by laughter. They told stories, shared photographs from phones that were carefully tucked inside pockets, protected from the wet. One man, younger than the others, showed Eleanor a picture of his daughter, pride shining in his eyes. She's 6, wants to be an astronaut. Another spoke of his mother, who had been recently diagnosed with Alzheimer's. She doesn't know me most days now, but I visit anyway. Sometimes she thinks I'm my dad. That's okay. A third talked about going back to school, earning a degree in social work. Want to work with homeless vets. Too many guys falling through the cracks. Eleanor listened to all of them, and with each story, each revelation, her heart expanded. She had thought her life had shrunk to the size of her small house, her small routines, her small world. But tonight, her living room contained multitudes, pain and hope, loss and determination, fear and courage. These men carried all of it, just as she did, just as everyone did. Around midnight, one of the hypothermic riders, a man named Danny who couldn't have been more than 25, began to shake violently. Eleanor was at his side immediately, her teacher instincts transforming into something more primal, a mother's urgency. She had raised a son, had nursed him through fevers and falls, and her hands remembered what to do. More blankets, she commanded, and they appeared instantly. Hot water bottle. Does anyone have one? They didn't, but Jack improvised, filling empty water bottles with hot water and wrapping them in towels. Eleanor placed them against Danny's core, under his arms, against his abdomen. She elevated his legs slightly, checked his pulse, and monitored his breathing. The other men watched in silence, their faces tense with concern. Is he going to be okay? One of them asked, his voice cracking slightly. He will be, Eleanor said with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. But he needs to stay warm. No one is going anywhere tonight. The declaration settled over the room. They had already known it, but hearing her say it made it official. They would spend the night here, in this widow's home, dependent on her kindness for their survival. As the night deepened, the men settled into whatever spaces they could find. Some sat on her couch in chairs, others on the floor, a few at her kitchen table. They were careful with her things, moving with an exaggerated gentleness that touched her. They folded blankets neatly when they shifted positions, cleaned up after themselves, spoke in hushed tones as the hour grew later. Jack Reeves found Eleanor in the kitchen as she was washing the last of the bowls. He picked up a dish towel without asking and began to dry. You didn't have to do this, he said after a moment. Most people would have turned us away. We look like exactly the kind of men you shouldn't let into your home. Eleanor considered this, her hands still in the soapy water. My husband used to say that the roughest exteriors often protect the softest hearts. He said the men who had seen the worst of the world often fought the hardest to preserve what's good in it. Jack was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. Your husband was a wise man. He was, Eleanor agreed. I miss him every day. The house feels too quiet without him. Too empty. How long? 8 years. Cancer. Agent Orange exposure from Vietnam. It took him slowly. I'm sorry. They finished the dishes in comfortable silence. When the last bowl was dried and put away, Jack turned to her. Tomorrow, when the storm clears, we'll leave and you'll never see us again. But I want you to know that what you did tonight matters. It matters more than you know. Some of these guys, they've been told their whole lives that they're not worth helping, that they're too rough, too damaged, too much. You didn't see any of that. You just saw people who needed help. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. We're all just people, she said softly. All of us are carrying things that hurt. All of us are trying to make it through. The night stretched on. Eleanor insisted the 3 hypothermic riders take her son's old room upstairs, the only bedroom in the house besides her own. She made up the beds with fresh sheets, tucked extra blankets around them, and checked on them every hour. The others settled throughout the first floor, their large bodies folded into whatever spaces they could find. Around 3 in the morning, Eleanor made her way through the darkened house one final time. The fire in the wood stove had burned down to glowing embers. In its faint light, she could see the sleeping forms of 20 men who had arrived as strangers and were leaving as something else. Something she didn't quite have a word for yet. She paused by the mantelpiece where Thomas's photograph stood in its place of honor. The picture showed him at 50, just a few years before the cancer diagnosis, before the treatments that would ultimately fail. He was smiling in that quiet way he had, the smile that said he was content with his life, content with his choices, content with her. I hope I did right, Thomas, she whispered to the photograph. I hope you'd be proud. In the flickering firelight, she could almost imagine him nodding, his hand reaching out to squeeze hers the way he had done 10,000 times during their marriage. She could almost hear his voice. You did good, Ellie. You did really good. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her bedroom, her body aching with exhaustion, but her heart feeling lighter than it had in months. She fell asleep to the sound of gentle snoring from the men below, the sound of life filling her home again, and it was the best sleep she had had in years. Dawn came slowly, the sun struggling to break through the heavy cloud cover that still hung over Millbrook. Eleanor woke to silence, the kind of deep silence that comes after a major storm. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, wondering if she had dreamed the entire night. But no, there they were, 20 large men sleeping in her living room, dining room, and kitchen, their leather jackets hung carefully over her chairs, their boots lined neatly by her door. She made coffee quietly, not wanting to wake them yet. Through her kitchen window, she could see the devastation the storm had left behind. Snow had drifted as high as her windowsills. Her driveway was completely buried. The motorcycles were barely visible, chrome lumps under white blankets. The road beyond was impassable, a pristine white expanse with no trace of asphalt visible. They would need to stay at least another day, maybe 2. The realization should have worried her, but instead she felt a strange anticipation. For the first time in 8 years, she would not spend the day alone. For the first time in 8 years, she would cook for more than one. For the first time in 8 years, her home would echo with voices instead of silence. The men woke gradually, their movements stiff and slow. They stretched carefully, working out the kinks from sleeping on floors and couches. When they saw the depth of the snow outside, their expressions turned grim. We're snowed in, Jack said, stating the obvious. Could be days before they plow this road. Then you'll stay, Eleanor said firmly. I have food enough for a few days if we're careful. We'll manage. What followed was a day unlike any Eleanor had experienced in recent memory. The men, once they accepted they weren't going anywhere, threw themselves into making themselves useful. They shoveled her porch and walkway, dug out paths to her barn, brought in firewood, and fixed a loose shutter that had been banging for months. They worked with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, each man knowing instinctively what needed to be done. Inside, Eleanor cooked. She made breakfast from her dwindling supplies, scrambled eggs, toast, and bacon that she had been saving for a special occasion. The men ate gratefully, praising her cooking with genuine enthusiasm. They washed their own dishes, dried them, and put them away without being asked. As the day progressed, the barriers between them continued to dissolve. The men told stories of their rides, their adventures, their brotherhood. They spoke of charity rides for children's hospitals, escort services for abuse survivors, and fundraisers for veterans. Eleanor learned that the Iron Brotherhood, despite their intimidating appearance, spent most of their time doing community service. People cross the street when they see us coming. One man named Marcus said with a rueful smile. They don't know we just finished building a wheelchair ramp for a disabled vet. They just see the leather and the tattoos and assume the worst. I assumed the worst, Eleanor admitted. When I saw you at my door, I was terrified. But you opened the door anyway, Jack pointed out. That takes real courage. The kind most people don't have. That afternoon, Danny, the young rider who had been hypothermic, came downstairs. He was weak but recovering, and he made his way directly to Eleanor. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you saved my life last night." "I know that. I was gone. I couldn't feel anything, couldn't think straight. If you hadn't taken us in, I'd be dead right now." Eleanor patted his hand, uncomfortable with the intensity of his gratitude. "You would have done the same for me." "I hope I would have," Danny said. "I really hope I would have. But I don't know. I'd like to think I'm that kind of person, but I've crossed the street before. I've judged people. You didn't. You looked at 20 scary bikers, and you saw people who needed help. That's who you are." The second night was easier than the first. The men were warm, fed, and grateful. They entertained Eleanor with stories, making her laugh harder than she had in years. They asked about her life, her teaching career, and her marriage to Thomas. They listened with genuine interest as she spoke about her son Michael, about the students she still kept in touch with, about the small joys of her days. One man, a tattooed giant named Bear, pulled out a harmonica and played haunting melodies that filled the house with unexpected beauty. Another taught Eleanor a card game she had never heard of, and they played until late into the night, their laughter echoing off walls that had been silent for too long. On the third morning, they heard it, the distant rumble of a snowplow making its way down Riverside Road. The men cheered, then immediately fell silent, the realization hitting them all at once. The road being clear meant they could leave. It meant this unexpected sanctuary would end. They prepared to go with obvious reluctance. Jackets were gathered, boots were laced, and motorcycles were dug out from under the snow. Eleanor made them a final breakfast, using the last of her supplies, and they ate slowly, drawing out the meal as long as possible. Jack pulled Eleanor aside before they left. "I don't know how to thank you properly," he said. "You gave us more than shelter. You gave us dignity. You gave us respect. That's rare. You gave me something too," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the tears that suddenly threatened. "You gave me company. You gave me purpose. You reminded me what it feels like to be needed." Jack reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "This has my number. If you ever need anything, and I mean anything, you call. You'll have 200 brothers willing to help you before the sun sets. That's a promise." Eleanor took the card, knowing she would probably never use it, but touched by the gesture nonetheless. They filed out one by one, each man stopping to thank her personally, some with words, some with awkward hugs, all with genuine warmth. They mounted their bikes, the engines roaring to life in staggered sequence, and Eleanor stood on her porch watching them prepare to leave. Jack was the last to mount his bike. He looked back at her small house, at the elderly woman standing on the porch wrapped in her threadbare coat, and something passed across his face. "A decision is being made. We'll be back," he called over the engine noise. "Next week. To check on you." Eleanor waved, assuming it was a kindness he wouldn't keep. Men said things like that all the time. But as she watched them ride away, their engines fading into the distance, she felt the silence of her home settle around her like a familiar but suddenly unwelcome coat. The next week passed slowly. Eleanor fell back into her routines, but they felt different now. The silence that had been comfortable was now oppressive. Her meals for one felt inadequate after cooking for 20. The house, which had felt appropriately sized, now felt cavernous and empty. She thought about the men often, wondering where they were, hoping they were safe on the road. She looked at Jack's business cards several times, running her finger over the embossed logo of the Iron Brotherhood, but she never called. What would she say? That she was lonely? That she missed having them there? It seemed absurd. On the 8th day after they left, Eleanor heard engines. She assumed they were passing by, perhaps heading to the highway. But the sound grew louder, then stopped. She went to her window and looked out. 20 motorcycles were pulling into her driveway. The same 20. Jack Reeves dismounted first, and behind him came the others, and behind them came something that made Eleanor's breath catch. More motorcycles. Many more. They poured down Riverside Road like a river of chrome, dozens upon dozens of them, filling her street, her driveway, her entire property. The noise was tremendous, the sight overwhelming. Eleanor stumbled back from the window, her heart pounding with confusion and the first stirrings of fear. What was happening? Had she made a terrible mistake? Had their kindness been a facade? The engines cut off one by one until silence descended again. Eleanor's hands trembled as she made her way to her door. She opened it slowly, preparing for the worst, and found Jack Reeves standing on her porch with an expression that was part embarrassment, part pride, and entirely sincere. "Ma'am," he said, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. But I talked to the club about what you did for us. And then I talked to some other clubs. And word spread. These men." He gestured to the sea of bikers filling her property. "They all wanted to meet the woman who saved 20 of their brothers without hesitation. They wanted to say thank you." Eleanor stared past him at the crowd. There had to be 200 of them, maybe more. They stood quietly, respectfully, waiting. She saw men and women, young and old, all wearing leather jackets with various club patches. The Iron Brotherhood was there, but so were the Steel Riders, the Road Warriors, the Liberty Legion, and a dozen other groups she didn't recognize. "I don't understand," she said weakly. An older man stepped forward, his white beard braided, his eyes kind. "Ma'am, my name is Frank Morrison. I'm the founding member of the Liberty Legion. 20 years ago, I got caught in a storm in Montana. A woman like you took me in, sheltered me, saved my life. I never forgot it. When Jack told us what you did, I knew we had to do something." Another man approached, younger, with a prosthetic leg visible below his jeans. "I'm Marcus Webb, Road Warriors. I'm a vet, just like your husband. We take care of our own, and we take care of people who take care of our own. You took care of 20 of our brothers. That makes you family." Eleanor felt overwhelmed, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Jack took her elbow gently, steadying her. "We're not here to scare you," he said softly. "We're here to help you. Danny told us about your house, about how things are falling apart. We're here to fix them. All of them, if you'll let us." "I can't afford," Eleanor started to say, but Frank cut her off. "No money. This is about brotherhood, about honor, about paying forward the kind of kindness that saved all our lives at one point or another." What happened next would become the talk of Millbrook for years to come. 200 bikers descended on Eleanor Hayes's small property and transformed it. Some brought tools and materials. Others brought food and supplies. They worked with military precision, dividing into teams, each with a specific task. Her roof, which had been leaking for 3 years, was stripped and reshingled. Her gutters, clogged and sagging, were cleaned and repaired. The porch, with its rotting boards and wobbly railing, was rebuilt from the foundation up. Her barn, which she had considered tearing down, was reinforced and restored. The broken windows in her garage were replaced. The driveway was resurfaced. The fence line was mended. Inside, a crew of women from the various clubs descended on her house. They cleaned with professional efficiency, scrubbing years of accumulated neglect from corners Eleanor could no longer reach. They organized her pantry, her closets, and her storage areas. They washed windows until they sparkled. One woman, a plumber by trade, fixed her constantly running toilet and the slow drain in her kitchen sink. Eleanor wandered through the chaos in a daze. Everywhere she looked, people were working, sweating, laughing, transforming her property. When she tried to help, she was gently but firmly told to sit down, rest, and enjoy watching her home come back to life. The neighbors came out to watch. At first, they stood in their yards nervously, unsure what to make of the biker invasion. But as the day progressed and the nature of the work became clear, their fear turned to amazement. Some brought coffee and cookies. Others came to talk to Eleanor, hearing for the first time the story of what she had done. "You took in 20 strange men during a blizzard?" her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, said, her voice a mix of shock and admiration. "Eleanor, you're either the bravest woman I know or the craziest." "Maybe both," Eleanor admitted with a laugh. By late afternoon, the transformation was remarkable. Her house looked better than it had in a decade. The peeling paint had been scraped and repainted. The sagging gutters were straight and clean. The porch was level and solid. Even her garden had been weeded and mulched, prepared for spring planting. But they weren't done. 3 pickup trucks arrived, backed up to her garage, and began unloading. Firewood, stacked neatly until her garage was full. Groceries, enough to last her months. A new television to replace her ancient one. A computer tablet with internet already set up, along with instructions written in large, clear print. Gift cards to every grocery store and pharmacy in town. Eleanor sat on her newly rebuilt porch and wept. Jack sat beside her, not speaking, just present. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why all this?" "Because you matter," Jack said simply. "Because what you did mattered. Because in a world that tells us to be suspicious of each other, to lock our doors and look away, you opened yours. You reminded 20 men that kindness still exists. That's worth everything." As the sun began to set, the bikers prepared to leave. But first, they gathered in Eleanor's yard, 200 strong, and formed ranks. Frank Morrison stepped forward with a wooden plaque, beautifully carved, and presented it to Eleanor. "Honorary member of the Iron Brotherhood," she read through her tears. "For acts of courage and kindness above and beyond. Eleanor Hayes, you are forever one of us." The bikers applauded, not wildly but with deep, respectful appreciation. Some saluted, a military gesture that spoke to shared service and sacrifice. Eleanor clutched the plaque to her chest, unable to speak through her emotion. One by one, they mounted their bikes. The engine started in a rolling thunder that shook the ground. And then, in perfect formation, they rode past her house. Each rider raised a hand in salute as they passed, a gesture of respect and brotherhood. The procession took 15 minutes, the noise tremendous but somehow beautiful, a mechanical symphony of gratitude. Eleanor stood on her porch, waving until the last bike disappeared around the corner and the sound of engines faded into the distance. Silence returned to Riverside Road, but it was different now. It wasn't the silence of isolation. It was the silence of peace. Her neighbors gathered around her, asking questions, exclaiming over the transformation of her property, and for the first time in 8 years, Eleanor felt part of her community again. The men and women who had been strangers were now friends, brought together by the extraordinary events they had witnessed. That night, Eleanor sat in her living room, which still smelled faintly of leather and motor oil. The new television played softly in the background, but she wasn't watching it. She was looking at the plaque in her hands, running her fingers over the carved letters. On the mantelpiece, Thomas smiled from his photograph. Eleanor smiled back. "I did good, didn't I, Thomas?" she whispered. She imagined his response, could almost hear his voice soft and proud. "You did better than good, Ellie. You did what matters most." The weeks that followed brought changes Eleanor couldn't have anticipated. Jack Reeves called every few days, just checking in, making sure she was okay. Other members of the Iron Brotherhood stopped by occasionally, always respectful, always welcome. They brought firewood without being asked, shoveled her walkway after snowstorms, and fixed small things around the house that needed attention. But it wasn't just the practical help that transformed Eleanor's life. It was the sense of belonging that had been missing for so long. The bikers had given her something she hadn't known she'd lost: a tribe, a community, people who saw her not as an elderly widow to be pitied, but as someone worthy of respect and protection. Her son Michael called one Sunday, as he always did, and Eleanor told him the story. She could hear the disbelief in his voice, the concern, the worry that his mother had lost her mind. "Mom, you let 20 bikers into your house. During a blizzard? What were you thinking? They could have hurt you, robbed you, anything. But they didn't," Eleanor said calmly. "They were grateful. They were kind. And Michael, they came back with 200 others and fixed everything around here that's been falling apart. The roof doesn't leak anymore. The porch is solid. I have enough firewood to last 2 winters." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Michael's voice, quieter now, almost ashamed. "I should have been the one fixing those things. I should have come home and helped you. I knew things were bad, and I just kept sending money instead of showing up. You have your own life, sweetheart, your own family. I never expected you to drop everything and come fix my porch. But these strangers did. These bikers you didn't even know. They're not strangers anymore," Eleanor said softly. "They're family. Different kind of family, but family nonetheless." After that call, something shifted between Eleanor and her son. He began calling more often, not just on Sundays, but midweek too. He sent more photos of his boys. He talked about planning a visit in the summer, bringing the whole family. The bikers, in some strange way, had reminded him of what he'd been neglecting. Spring came to Millbrook, bringing with it the thaw and the return of green to the world. Eleanor's garden, which had been little more than weeds for years, bloomed magnificently. The bikers had amended the soil, planted bulbs, and set up a simple irrigation system. Tulips and daffodils burst into color, transforming her yard into something beautiful. She spent her days outside again, tending to the garden with renewed energy. Neighbors stopped by more often now, drawn by the flowers and by Eleanor herself, who seemed to have shed years in just a few months. She smiled more, laughed more, and engaged with the world more. One warm April afternoon, Eleanor heard motorcycles approaching. She looked up from her wedding to see Jack Reeves pulling into her driveway, and behind him, a dozen other Iron Brotherhood members. But this time, they had passengers. Children. Small children, some in special seats mounted on the bikes, all wearing oversized helmets and grinning with excitement. Jack dismounted and walked over, returning her questioning look with a sheepish smile. "Hope you don't mind the surprise, Eleanor. But these kids are from the Children's Hospital in Harrisburg. They've been sick, some of them for a long time. We take them on rides when they're well enough, give them something to look forward to. We told them about you, about the nice lady who helped us in the storm. They wanted to meet you." Eleanor's heart melted as the children were carefully helped off the motorcycles. There were 8 of them, ranging from about 5 to 12 years old. Some were thin, clearly still recovering from treatments. Others bore visible scars, but all had eyes that shone with excitement and joy. "You're the angel lady," one little girl exclaimed, running up to Eleanor with her arms outstretched. Eleanor knelt down, catching the child in a hug. "I'm not an angel, sweetie. I'm just Eleanor. Jack said you saved his whole club in a blizzard. That sounds like an angel to me." The afternoon that followed was pure magic. Eleanor brought out cookies she had baked that morning, lemonade from her refrigerator, and spread blankets on her lawn. The children sat in a circle around her as she told them stories, not about the blizzard, but about her years as a teacher, about the funny things students had done, about the joys of learning and growing. The bikers stood back, watching with expressions that mixed tough guy stoicism with unmistakable tenderness. These men, who looked like they could break bones without effort, were gentle as lambs with the children, lifting them carefully, making sure they were comfortable, wiping away tears when one child got overwhelmed. Eleanor learned that this was what the Iron Brotherhood did regularly. They worked with children's hospitals, taking sick kids on supervised rides, giving them experiences outside the hospital walls, and helping families cope with the financial and emotional burdens of childhood illness. The charity rides Jack had mentioned during the blizzard were real, substantive, and ongoing. "We ride for those who can't," Jack explained as they watched the children play in Eleanor's yard. "These kids, they're fighters. They're tougher than any of us." Taking them on rides, making them smile, it reminds us what's important. It keeps us grounded. Before they left, each child hugged Eleanor goodbye. The little girl who had called her an angel pressed a drawing into her hands, a crayon masterpiece showing a woman surrounded by motorcycles and hearts. "That's you," the girl said seriously. "The lady who teaches everybody to be kind." After they left, Eleanor put the drawing on her refrigerator, where it joined photos of her son and grandchildren. Family came in many forms, she was learning. Biology was just one of them. The summer brought more changes. Michael made good on his promise and came to visit with his wife, Sarah, and their 2 boys, aged 8 and 10. They stayed for a week, and Eleanor showed them around Millbrook, introduced them to her neighbors, and took them to all the places she and Thomas used to love. On the 3rd day of their visit, Jack Reeves stopped by with a few other club members. Michael tensed immediately, his lawyer instincts kicking in, seeing potential danger. But Eleanor watched as her grandson's eyes went wide with excitement at the sight of the motorcycles. "Grandma, you know real bikers?" The oldest breathed. "I know real people who happen to ride motorcycles," Eleanor corrected gently. "Jack, these are my grandsons, Tommy and Jake. Boys, this is my friend Jack." Jack shook hands with each boy seriously, treating them like adults. "Your grandma is pretty special. She saved my life and the lives of my brothers. We don't forget things like that." Michael pulled Eleanor aside later. "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I judged them without knowing them. I'm sorry I judged you for helping them. That man clearly loves you like family." "They all do," Eleanor said. "And I love them right back. They gave me back my life, Michael. Not just by fixing the house, but by reminding me that I still have something to offer the world. That I still matter." Fall came, painting Millbrook in shades of red and gold. Eleanor's first anniversary of the blizzard approached, and she wondered if the bikers remembered, if they thought about that night the way she did. She had her answer when Jack called. "Eleanor, the club wants to do something special. It's been a year since you took us in. We'd like to throw you a party. At the clubhouse. Nothing fancy, just food and friends. Would you come?" Eleanor had never been to a biker clubhouse. She imagined something dark and seedy, full of smoke and danger. But she trusted Jack, so she said yes. The clubhouse was nothing like she expected. It was a large, well-maintained building on the outskirts of town, with a parking lot full of motorcycles and pickup trucks. Inside, it was clean and welcoming, with photos covering the walls, charity rides, hospital visits, veterans events, community service projects. This wasn't a den of criminals. It was a community center for people whom society had written off. The party was already in full swing when she arrived. Not just Iron Brotherhood members, but people from all over. The children from the hospital visit, now several months healthier, veterans from the local VA, families from the neighborhood, even some of Eleanor's fellow retired teachers who had heard about her and wanted to meet the famous bikers. A banner hung across the main room. "Thank you, Eleanor. 1 year of friendship." Eleanor was overwhelmed. She moved through the crowd, greeted by people she knew and strangers who hugged her like old friends. They told her stories she had never heard, about how the Iron Brotherhood had helped them in various ways. Fixing cars for single mothers, paying utility bills for struggling families, mentoring at-risk youth, building wheelchair ramps, escorting abuse survivors to court. "We're not perfect," Jack said when he gave a short speech. We've all made mistakes. Some of us have pasts we're not proud of, but we try to do better. We try to give back. And Eleanor Hayes showed us that kindness given freely, without judgment, without expectation of return, that's the most powerful thing in the world. She could have seen us as threats. Instead, she saw us as people who needed help. That one act of grace changed 20 lives. And those 20 lives have touched hundreds more. That's the ripple effect of kindness. Eleanor stood to speak, her hands shaking slightly, but her voice strong. I'm an old woman who spent too many years alone and afraid. You all gave me back my courage. You showed me that community isn't about blood or shared history. It's about showing up for each other. It's about seeing the humanity in people who look different from us. My husband always said that we're all just walking each other home. You've been walking beside me this past year, and I'm grateful beyond words. The party lasted late into the evening. Eleanor danced, actually danced, for the first time since Thomas died. A huge bear of a man named Tiny twirled her carefully around the floor, while others clapped and cheered. She laughed until her sides hurt, ate until she was full, and felt more alive than she had in a decade. When Jack drove her home that night, carefully, protectively, she looked at the stars through the bike's windshield and felt something she thought she'd lost forever: hope. Not just hope for tomorrow, but excitement for it. Winter returned to Millbrook, and with it came the anniversary of that fateful blizzard night. Eleanor woke early, made herself tea, and sat by her window watching the snow fall gently. It was nothing like the storm of a year ago, just a soft, peaceful accumulation of white that made the world quiet and clean. Her doorbell rang mid-morning. She opened it to find Jack standing there alone, holding a small wrapped package. Didn't want you to spend today by yourself, he said simply. Figured you might be thinking about it. I am, Eleanor admitted. How could I not? It changed everything. They sat together in her living room, drinking coffee, talking about the year that had passed. Jack told her about the changes in his own life. How taking care of Eleanor had reminded him to call his own mother more often. How he'd started volunteering at the VA hospital. How he'd met a woman, a nurse, who saw past the leather and tattoos to the man beneath. You did that, he said. You reminded me that I deserve to be seen as more than my worst decisions. If you could look at 20 scary bikers and see people worth helping, maybe I could look at myself and see someone worth loving. Eleanor opened the package he'd brought. Inside was a leather jacket, small enough to fit her, with an Iron Brotherhood patch on the back and her name embroidered on the front. Below her name, 3 words: Honorary Road Captain. You lead us, Eleanor, Jack said when he saw her tears. Maybe not on the road, but in everything that matters. You lead us in courage, in kindness, in grace. We thought you should have the patch to prove it. Eleanor put on the jacket. It fit perfectly. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw not an elderly widow fading into irrelevance, but a woman who mattered, who belonged, who had a tribe that would protect her as fiercely as she had protected them. The years that followed were full in ways Eleanor had never imagined possible. She became a fixture at Iron Brotherhood events, the grandmother of the entire club. She attended weddings and funerals, celebrated births and mourned losses, offered wisdom and received love in return. She watched young men straighten their lives out, encouraged by the example of brotherhood and service they saw in the club. She tutored children whose parents were struggling, drawing on her decades of teaching experience. She spoke at high schools about prejudice and perception, telling her story to teenagers who needed to hear that people aren't always what they seem. Michael visited more often, bringing the boys to spend time with their remarkable grandmother. Tommy and Jake grew up knowing the bikers as extended family, learning from them about loyalty, service, and the importance of looking past surface appearances. When Tommy turned 16 and wanted a motorcycle, it was the Iron Brotherhood who taught him to ride safely, who drilled into him the responsibility that came with freedom, who made sure he understood that the machine was powerful and demanded respect. Eleanor's health remained good, better than it had been in years. The doctors said it was remarkable for a woman her age. Eleanor knew it was because she had reasons to stay healthy. She had people depending on her, people who needed her wisdom and her cookies and her ability to see the best in everyone. On her 80th birthday, the Iron Brotherhood threw her a party that became the stuff of local legend. They closed down Main Street in Millbrook, brought in food trucks and live bands, and turned the entire downtown into a celebration. Over 500 people attended, bikers from clubs across 3 states, her former students ranging from their 20s to their 60s, neighbors, veterans, children from the hospital programs, and family. The mayor of Millbrook gave a speech, presenting Eleanor with a proclamation declaring her birthday Eleanor Hayes Day in perpetuity. The local newspaper ran a feature story about her, complete with photos of her wearing her leather jacket, surrounded by her biker family. "Who would have thought," Eleanor said in an interview, "that opening my door on a stormy night would lead to all this? I was just doing what any decent person should do." But they turned it into something bigger. They turned one act of kindness into a movement of kindness. That's the real story here. As Eleanor approached her mid-80s, she began to slow down. The energy that had carried her through years of events and activities began to ebb. Jack noticed first the way she held the railing a bit tighter when climbing stairs, the way she needed to rest more frequently, the way her memory occasionally slipped. The Iron Brotherhood responded the way a family does. They created a schedule, making sure someone checked on Eleanor every day. They hired a part-time nurse, paying for it collectively when Eleanor protested she couldn't afford it. They organized meal trains, grocery runs, and prescription pickups. Whatever she needed, whenever she needed it, someone was there. "You took care of us," Jack said when Eleanor tried to argue that she didn't need so much help. "Now we take care of you." That's how family works. Eleanor's final winter came gently. She spent Christmas surrounded by more people than her small house could comfortably hold. Michael and his family, Jack and several other core club members, neighbors, and a revolving door of visitors who wanted to share the holiday with her. In January, she caught pneumonia. It started as a cold but progressed quickly, her aging immune system unable to fight it off effectively. The hospital admitted her, and immediately, the Iron Brotherhood mobilized. They filled the waiting room, a leather-clad army maintaining vigil. The hospital staff, initially nervous about the intimidating presence, quickly learned these weren't men to fear. They brought coffee for nurses working double shifts, held doors for visitors carrying flowers, and organized the waiting room so families could sit together. Michael flew in immediately, and he sat beside his mother's bed holding her hand. Jack was there too, on the other side, his gruff face soft with worry and love. Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness over several days. When she was lucid, she smiled at the faces around her, touched that so many people cared enough to be there. On her last day, when the doctors told them there was nothing more to be done, that her body was simply giving out after a long, full life, Eleanor woke one final time. The room was full. Michael, Jack, Bear, Marcus, Danny, who she'd saved from hypothermia all those years ago, and a dozen others. "Did I do okay?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Mom, you did more than okay," Michael said, tears streaming down his face. "You were extraordinary. You changed the world, Eleanor," Jack added, his voice breaking. "One act of kindness at a time." Eleanor smiled, a small, peaceful smile. "Tell the children to keep being kind," she whispered. "Tell them it matters. Tell them it ripples." Those were her last words. She closed her eyes and slipped away peacefully, surrounded by love, her hand held by the son she'd raised and the found family she'd created. The funeral was held at the largest church in Millbrook, and even it wasn't big enough. Over 1,000 people attended. Bikers from clubs across the entire East Coast, former students spanning 5 decades, veterans, hospital staff, neighbors, townspeople, and countless others whose lives Eleanor had touched. The Iron Brotherhood formed an honor guard, standing at attention in their leather jackets as the service proceeded. They didn't hide their tears. These rough, tough men who faced down all kinds of dangers wept openly for the woman who had shown them grace. Michael gave the eulogy, speaking about his mother's capacity for love, her courage, and her willingness to see the best in everyone. But it was Jack who told the story that would be repeated for years to come. 8 years ago, he said, his voice carrying through the packed church, 20 scared, freezing men knocked on Eleanor's door in the middle of the worst blizzard any of us had ever seen. She had every reason to turn us away. She was alone, vulnerable, and we looked like exactly the kind of men you should fear. But she opened that door. She fed us, warmed us, saved us. And in doing so, she showed us what we could be. Not criminals or outcasts or threats to society, but men capable of kindness, capable of service, capable of love. She saw past the leather and the tattoos and the rough exteriors to the hearts underneath. And because she saw us that way, we learned to see ourselves that way. Every charity ride we've done since then, every child we've helped, every veteran we've supported, every family we've assisted, it all traces back to that one night when Eleanor Hayes opened her door. She taught us that kindness begets kindness, that grace creates grace, that love multiplies when you give it freely. She was our teacher in the most important lessons of all. The funeral procession stretched for miles. Over 300 motorcycles escorted Eleanor to her final resting place beside Thomas in the small cemetery on the edge of town. The sound of their engines was a mechanical hymn, a thunderous farewell to a woman who had taught them what it meant to be truly brave. At the graveside, after the service ended and most mourners had left, Jack placed something on Eleanor's casket before it was lowered into the ground. Her leather jacket, the one with the honorary road captain patch. She would ride eternal with her brothers, forever part of the Iron Brotherhood she had transformed through one simple act of kindness. In the months that followed, the bikers ensured Eleanor's legacy lived on. They established the Eleanor Hayes Foundation, dedicated to helping elderly and vulnerable people in the community. They organized regular welfare checks for isolated seniors, home repair services for those who couldn't afford them, meal deliveries, transportation to medical appointments, and companionship for the lonely. Michael worked with them to create a scholarship in his mother's name for students pursuing careers in teaching or social work. The first recipient was a young woman who had grown up in foster care, someone Eleanor had mentored in her final years. The story of Eleanor and the Iron Brotherhood spread far beyond Millbrook. It was picked up by news outlets, shared millions of times on social media, turned into articles and blog posts, and eventually became a book. But more importantly, it inspired action. People across the country reached out to help their elderly neighbors. Biker clubs in other states started similar community service programs. Strangers began looking at each other with less suspicion and more compassion. Years later, on the anniversary of Eleanor's death, the Iron Brotherhood still gathers at her grave. They bring flowers, share stories, and renew their commitment to living the values she taught them. New members hear the story as part of their initiation, learning that being part of the Brotherhood means more than riding motorcycles. It means serving the community, protecting the vulnerable, and never judging someone by their appearance. Tommy, Eleanor's eldest grandson, joined the Iron Brotherhood when he turned 21. He rides wearing a patch that says Legacy Rider, Eleanor Hayes, carrying on his grandmother's memory with every mile. He speaks at schools about prejudice and perception, telling Eleanor's story to new generations who need to hear it. The small house on Riverside Road, where it all began, became a community center. Michael donated it to the Eleanor Hayes Foundation, and it now serves as a gathering place for seniors, a food pantry, a counseling center, and headquarters for the community service programs the bikers run. A bronze plaque beside the front door reads, "On this spot, one act of kindness changed 1,000 lives." Let that be a lesson for us all. Sometimes, on winter nights when snow falls softly on Millbrook, people swear they can hear the distant sound of motorcycle engines on the wind, a ghostly procession riding eternal. The old-timers in town smile when they hear it. They know it's just the Iron Brotherhood out on a night ride. But they like to think Eleanor rides with them still, her spirit carried on chrome and steel, forever reminding them that courage and kindness can change the world. Because that's the truth, Eleanor taught them. You don't have to be young or strong or powerful to make a difference. You just have to be willing to open your door when someone knocks. You have to be willing to see past fear to the humanity underneath. You have to believe that kindness, even when it's risky, even when it's hard, even when it seems small and insignificant, creates ripples that spread farther than you'll ever know. Eleanor Hayes was an ordinary woman who did an ordinary thing. She helped people who needed help. But she did it without hesitation, without judgment, without expectation of reward. And in doing so, she proved that there's nothing ordinary about kindness at all. It's the most extraordinary thing in the world. So here's the question her story leaves us with. Who will you help today? Whose door will you knock on? Or whose knock will you answer? Because somewhere out there, right now, someone needs what only you can give. Not money or power or expertise. Just presence. Just compassion. Just the willingness to see them as human and worthy of care. Eleanor's legacy lives on in every act of unexpected kindness. In every moment when someone chooses courage over fear, connection over isolation, grace over judgment. Her story reminds us that we're all capable of being heroes in the most important ways. We're all capable of opening doors. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that kindness is never wasted, that people are rarely what they seem, and that one brave choice can echo through generations. Share Eleanor's story, but more importantly, live it. Be the person who opens the door. Be the person who sees past the surface. Be the person who changes lives through simple acts of grace. Because in the end, that's what Eleanor would want. Not memorials or plaques or stories told about her, but a world where more people make the choice she made. To help, even when it's scary. To trust, even when it's risky. To love, even when it's hard. That's her legacy. That's her gift to all of us. And it's ours to pass on, one open door at a time. Thank you for reading Eleanor's story. Thank you for remembering that kindness matters. And thank you for being the kind of person who might just open your door when 20 strangers come knocking in a storm. Because the world needs more people like you. The world needs more people like Eleanor Hayes. The world needs more open doors.